All right, welcome back, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the parallel sessions. I certainly couldn't prevent myself from sampling a few of them, and what I've seen was actually quite intriguing. And so I'm particularly happy that now we have an opportunity to continue our discussion with actually the roundtable and the three panel moderators. So I'd like to welcome to the stage Emanuela Girardi, Fleur van Veenstra, Odessa Primus, and Barry O'Sullivan. Great to have you here for this last segment of our program. I hope you had as much fun as I had moderating these sessions. Certainly a lot of really interesting topics got discussed in the panels, in the parallel sessions, also in quite some depth. So it's not easy how to get this started, but I've given it a little bit of thought, and you know, what I heard last in the society session sort of inspired me, and that was a pretty passionate plea from one of the panelists, Nuria Oliver, that you know, we should really all, and that includes, of course, the big companies that are driving this in part. We should all think a little bit more about, you know, what kind of progress we really want. What is actually progress for us as societies, progress for the planet? And you know, today is Earth Day, as probably most of you know. So this is a special day where we should think quite a bit about what's good for the planet, what's good for us, and not just what's good for profit. And so I guess I'd like to start by reflecting a little bit about, you know, from the discussions that you've had in your panels and also in the roundtable that we've had with you, Emanuela. You know, when Executive Vice President Vestager says AI should be a force of progress in Europe, are we actually sure that we know what we mean by that? Are we sure? Do we have agreement as to what is progress for Europe? So yeah, maybe we'll start with Emanuela with a, you know, from the roundtable, you took anything on that question, and then we'll just quickly go around and give everybody a chance to weigh in on it.
Sure, definitely. No, I definitely agree with what the Vice President said. I think that asking ourselves the right question, probably it's the most important point. And referring to this, I think that the Vice President said that, okay, everybody said basically agreed on the fact that the AI package is quite an impressive package. So everybody had a very positive thoughts about it. But the point is that she also said that we also have to look at the devil, because the devil is in the details. And so we have to try to look at these details and try to fill the gap. And I think that what is probably missing, and this is my personal opinion, is, and considering that today is the Earth Day, and also considering that today, I mean, the global leaders are gathering for the climate summit, and the European vision of AI is human-centric. So it's really focusing on enhancing the well-being of humans. And I think that probably here the Commission could have been a little bit more ambitious, and maybe we should have moved from a human-centric approach to a planet-centric approach. And this is really important for the goals. I mean, which kind of progress do we want to reach? So in the coordinated plan, we are also talking about digital, the Green Deal, and also the digital package and so on. But I think that really here, I mean, and I hope that in the dialogue that was really, I mean, requested by everybody, this open dialogue in the Parliament and with all the stakeholders, we will really discuss about this point, because this is a key point, and we should really move, I think, from a human-centric approach to a more global planet-centric approach. And so this, I think, it's one of the main points. Another interesting point that I'm also going to ask to the other moderators that was very interesting was brought up by Eva Martin-Knight, and it was the concept of the reputation, because everybody is talking about this, if this AI regulation package is too excessive, but we should really try to promote also a positive approach in the fact that it's, I mean, it's a matter of reputation. If we want to attract talents and investors and startups and to move from, I mean, from the lab to the market, we should really, I mean, try also to promote a positive approach. And so not only to focus on what we cannot do, I mean, with this AI system, but really what we can do. And so it goes back, we go back to this progress that was mentioned by the Vice President. And the last point that I think it was very important that was brought up by Christian Kersting, it was about research fundings. So basically yesterday in the US, they presented a Frontier Act where it's a law proposal calling for 100 billion in governmental spending for 5 years in basic and advanced technology research and science. So I think that 100 billion is lots of money. And considering what was mentioned in the coordinated plan, what was presented by Lucilla Scioli this morning about the strategy of going from lab to market, and also the strategy about coordinating the research, different research initiatives. So my question is, I mean, are we really doing enough? Because I mean, we have a very, fragmented landscape of research initiatives in Europe. And so I think that we should really foster the coordination. And I think that what Christian said, like we should really focus on creating a CERN for AI in Europe. And that is that this probably should be one of the main points that should be further discussed, and not only discussed, we should really go now into the execution of the plan. And this is probably, it's a little bit lacking in the coordinated plan. So I hope that the discussion will be focusing on this, coordination and execution.
Excellent, thank you. Maybe there I'd like to ask Odessa, who was head of the industry panel, in your panel, did anything like this come up at all? How did industry feel? What kind of responses do you get on the implications of all of this on industry? And I guess the obvious one we've heard, right? Sort of a certain fear that this might stifle innovation. And I think the Commission is well aware of it, Parliament is well aware of it, but there might be other interactions between the two elements that have been presented yesterday. I'm curious, did anything like this come up also in the context of the question we've just been discussing, for the good of society, for the good of all, for the health of the planet?
Well, I think there's always a balance between the importance of regulation and safety and trust in the processes, as well as innovation. And there's obviously a big difference between how Europe approaches this and how US and China approach this, for example. But yes, it definitely came up, and one of the things that was one of the statements was that regulation guarantees safety, which might be a priority. I think this is the opinion varies whether you're an AI researcher or represent the industry or represent policymaking. One of the things that was discussed is how SMEs are not digitized in Europe, and how it is important to include the discussion of AI in a more transparent way for a more general public. And there was a big discussion about public-private partnerships and engagement in between the sectors. And generally what I heard also from Emanuela, and this is definitely, I'm sure everyone was discussing this, is developing trust and bringing the topic of AI back down to earth and making it more of an everyday topic. And CERN for AI in Europe, I think, is definitely one of the approaches to sort of sterilize some of the fears and some of the overexcited discussions about AI, and making it more concrete in terms of what is actually out there. And another thing that was brought up is the necessity to showcase not just finalized projects, but make it transparent, the process of developing the AI and then implementing it in different industries, and also showcasing early results, making it more of not a secret project that is then exposed, but more of the whole process being showcased in a sort of normal light, rather than this is the result and it was a failure or it was a success.
Thank you very much, Odessa. Now you touched on another, I think, really crucial aspect, and I think we've heard somebody say earlier, Europe is a bit fragmented in terms of its AI community. And, as an AI researcher, I always tend to, celebrate the fact how well connected we are. But in a sense, of course, there is a lot of diversity there. And sometimes diversity and fragmentation can sort of be pretty close together, right? So that the line between them can be thin. And one of the areas in which I think this can be a particular problem is actually the area of education, because one of the things that Europe has is an enormous amount of talent, but that talent is distributed, right? And so, Barry, I'd like to turn to you and your panel. I mean, you are
Sure.
an excellent AI researcher, but you are also very passionate about education, right? And in your panel, I guess this challenge of the diversity, also the cultural diversity that we're facing, if we are going into university education and earlier phases of education, must have come up. Can you weigh in a little bit on that?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Holger. Yeah, sure. So the discussion on the panel was really excellent. We covered, I think, every age group. I think there was something for everybody in the discussion. One of the messages that came through very strongly was the need to get to people early. What I mean is that there's AI and computational thinking, and I suppose the humanities around AI and all of these sorts of topics, that these are instilled in people at a very young age. That, you know, AI is seen as the next digital skill, and so and you know, we start engaging with our children in terms of those things at elementary level, at secondary level, at higher level, and I suppose that's important so that people start thinking and become thinking about AI in a way that it's just another everyday technology. A lot of the narrative around AI in Europe is quite negative. It's about fear. It's about what can go wrong. But you know, invariably, I'm an AI optimist. I think tremendous things, tremendous positives come from AI every single day. And I think, you know, Holger, in your introduction today, you give many examples of that. In terms of diversity, yeah, I think, you know, this is something that we need to be careful of. We need to be absolutely certain that we get, you know, gender balances right, we get the different cultural perspectives in Europe right, that we have all of that coming to the table. And I think there was great optimism about that, because of course, you know, there are lots of particular mechanisms for doing that. There's particular funding mechanisms. You know, we talked a lot about IDA, we talked a lot about the elements of AI. So, you know, there's just tremendous initiatives that we should be very, very optimistic about. And I think, of course, the other point we're making is that, you know, Europe is a huge attractor of educational talent. You know, if you want to come and study in the best AI universities in the world, I think Europe has the best mix of quality and accessibility, you know. So, and, you know, there was a number of people spoke about, you know, very large scale PhD programs and the diversity of people who apply for those from all over the world. So of course, what Europe needs to do is make sure that these people stay. And of course, there's lots to be done there. Thank you.
Excellent. So here is a question from our audience that I'd actually like to follow up on. And I think, Odessa, you might be in a great position to take this one. And the question is, Eastern Europe is largely ignored in this European AI landscape. This goes against the principle of inclusiveness that Barry also just mentioned. Any plans on improving that? And I would like to add on a personal note, right, as somebody pretty engaged in trying to build bridges and bring the AI community together, I've always held the belief that, you know, we have enormous talent pools in Eastern Europe, Central Europe, Southern Europe, that are largely untapped, right? And I think there must be enormous opportunities for industry, for academia, for society in mobilizing these resources better. So Odessa, do you think more can be done, more needs to be done? You're in a country that has excellence and that enormous talent pool. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I definitely think more can be done. And I think when we talk about Europe, we need to talk about entire Europe and not just the EU. And I think that needs to be a priority for when we talk about AI in Europe, because it's not just an EU subject. And I think, you know, some of the problems you were talking about earlier, I think when we think of CERN, those problems sort of dissolve. And I think that's a perfect example. And I know Claire is sort of moving towards that. A perfect example of bringing the whole world together, not just Europe, and prioritizing areas which have a lot of talent, which in Eastern Europe we find a lot of. In the Czech Republic, as you were saying, that's where I am. We have a lot of institutions that have PhD students from the Balkans, and the talent there is enormous, and it's not something to be ignored. And I think we cannot really distinguish talent by which country you are from. And yeah, I think it's definitely something that can be made a lot better, and that we should stop talking about Europe as the EU. I think that's it's a key thing, and involving those countries more.
Absolutely. So Barry, before we go back to you, maybe a question for Fleur. So you moderated the society panel, and now we're talking about inclusiveness, we're talking about diversity, about the fact that not everybody is equally engaged, but probably also not everybody is right now equally affected by the kind of decisions that we're starting to see and plans that we're starting to see from Brussels. Any thoughts on this? Did anything come up in your panel that makes you reflect on this issue of, how evenly will Europe be affected by this proposed regulation, but also about by the investments that are in the updated action plan?
Well, I think that our panel touched on the topic that we, with AI, we know less than determine what tomorrow will look like. It's really the driver for the fourth revolution. And that perhaps I think we hardly talked about the technology, but I think the main question that really came up in our panel is, what do we want that society to look like? And do we know how to build that? So I think elements such as inclusiveness, they're tremendously important to that. And I think a follow-up question that was addressed very passionately, as you just mentioned, Holger, is, are we currently doing enough? Are our governments doing enough? Will this regulation indeed be able to fine-grain all the details in order to ensure that at least minimal harm is done or no harm is done whatsoever? And I think also a very passionate statement was made that we feel that currently companies, especially the larger tech companies, may not be doing enough yet to ensure that tomorrow's society will be inclusive, will be earth-focused, as I think was mentioned before, or even human-centric. Or as I heard someone say, they may be very human-centric, but not in a good way, as to tap all personal data. So I think we talked a lot about what would be good multidisciplinary approaches to ensure this. And also, will we keep up with technological advancement, not just in Europe, but worldwide, and be able to audit whether they indeed comply to the wishes we as citizens, as European citizens have for tomorrow's society. So yes, there's a lot at stake here, I would say.
I think that's something we can probably all agree on, that there is a lot at stake. And that's, when I listened into the panels, that's certainly a sentiment that seemed to come up quite a bit, that this is a very high stakes endeavor. So here's a question from the audience. Low risk AI is, according to the proposed regulation, permitted with no restrictions. Is then voluntary assurance or certification a feasible way for manufacturers of low risk AI to promote trust tangibly? And I'm curious, Barry, I actually want to go to you with this, because Ireland is one of these places that has been extremely successful to attract investment in ICT and in AI from overseas. And we know that a lot of our data is actually being processed through Ireland, right? Mm-hmm. So, and you're quite involved also with the Irish government in questions like this. So, this, I guess, is going a little bit back to the GAFA. Do we really think that in so-called low-risk applications of AI, we can simply trust industry to do the right thing? Or do we think that perhaps they have to go a little further in order to, fulfill the spirit of what's being proposed, not just the letter?
Yeah, so I think what's really important here is accountability. And coming at this from an education point of view, just giving the coming back to the panel, it's very important that people understand how these systems work and understand what the business model, what the technology does, at least at a superficial level, at a sufficient level that they know what's been done, because the public needs to be able to hold these companies to account. And I think what we've seen over the last few years is a greater level of accountability being demanded by European citizens in how technology and how their data and all these sorts of things is been performed. So I would have no concern per se with low risk AI systems being subject to self certification, provided that certification is transparent and accountable to the public, and the public can call people out. I suppose one of the great things about the regulation is going to be that it's going to give certainty to everybody. It's going to give certainty to where the acceptable lines are. And I think one of the reasons why AI has gotten a bad rap over the years in terms of privacy and these sorts of things, in many cases well deserved, is because of the bad practices of some companies. And one thing the regulation does in terms of helping competitiveness is it helps companies understand, well, they see where the lines are now. And I think regardless of whether things are being regulated in an ex ante fashion or being regulated in a conformity testing, self-assessment conformity test type regime, the really important thing is that the public can challenge these companies and can get access to what's being done. And I think that's where we as an AI community have a role to play. We need to make sure that we have an educated public, we have an engaged public. And I think then that's what the challenges are. I think companies of low risk AI, I think they will face different kinds of risks, and those risks are going to be the risk of being found on the wrong side of what the public deem acceptable. And I think we see lots of examples of that in an Irish context, but also in an international context.
Thank you very much, Barry. So, this reminds me of a conversation I had recently with a colleague in the Czech Republic who had worked for quite a few years for several of the big companies. And what he told me is, we in Europe, after returning to the Czech Republic, he told me, we in Europe should have the guts to just challenge some of the big companies on the services that they are actually providing, right? And so this is one of the reasons why I like to mention DeepL, not because it's a German startup or anything, right? But because they challenged Google in an area where Google is actually really good, and they succeeded, right? And so I think we can really learn from that in Europe that, maybe we don't have to be so shy about what we do. And I think the fact that, Nuria Oliver, who was on one of the panels in one of her teams, won the X Prize in pandemic response, that also shows we're maybe not so far behind in Europe. We just sometimes lack a little bit sort of this more North American ego that goes and says, here I am, this is the world, right? The world is my oyster. Let's pick this. Emanuela, I think you wanted to weigh in on that. I think you raised your hand.
Yeah, actually, I just wanted to say something, but then Barry said it, that it also emerged in our panel, and I wanted to highlight it, that basically one of the main points is that in Europe, we have a majority of SMEs, so small and medium enterprise, and I think that we really need to think how to support them on how to adopt, deploy, and use artificial intelligence. So I think that education is not only for the general public or for European citizens, but we really need to focus also on education for companies. This is one of the main points. And referring to the last point you said, yes, I think we're missing a little bit of moonshot mentality in Europe, and we really need to be more ambitious, to be more bold for this.
And of course, that maybe also applies a little bit to the Commission. I personally applaud the fact very much how ambitious and forward-looking they are with the regulation. What I was quite frankly missing in yesterday's announcement is to be equally proud and ambitious when it comes to investment into the ecosystem. That always seems to be sort of a second thought. And I think what we've heard quite a bit today is that perhaps that's not the best way to go about it. So with that said, we conducted a little survey earlier, and I wonder whether we can see the results of that to the question, is Europe going to be a leader in human-centric, trustworthy AI? Let's just see what our audience thought about that. So if we can have that here, that would be great. I think it's coming, and there it goes. So this is not so bad, right? But I think the challenge for all of us is to move that quite a bit to, absolutely, and I have no doubts, right? So many people seem to have perhaps a little bit too many doubts about this, right? So there's work to be done for sure. I have many other questions here on my sheet. I know that there are tons of questions from the audience we haven't had a chance to address. My apologies for that, but we wanted to keep the event to 2 hours, and for many of us, lunchtime is coming up, so that also is perhaps something we shouldn't intrude too much into. So I'd like to thank everyone once again for your participation, especially the moderators that have also helped us with this large part of the program. I want to thank all the panelists. I want to thank particularly Lucilla Scioli and her colleagues from Directorate A of DG Connect of the European Commission, the ICT 48 networks of centers of excellence, their coordinators and communication teams in particular. the vision communication team, which has done a tremendous job in making all of this possible here today, the communications and outreach team of AI for EU, another big EU consortium, and Claire, the Confederation of Laboratories for AI Research in Europe, who have given a lot of volunteer help in making this event possible. And then I want to single out one person who's really done a wonderful job, and I know she's gotten very little sleep because this was difficult to organize also sort of in the wake of the big announcement yesterday. And this is Eva Dolejalova from the Czech Institute of Informatics, Robotics and Cybernetics of the Czech Technical University in Prague, who had the technical lead on this event, and I think she pulled it off just magnificently. So thank you all very much. We will endeavor to answer many more of the audience's questions on our website. We will post additional materials there, links to the proposed legislation and the action plan. And please be in touch with us as an audience, you know, as engaged citizens across Europe. AI is the future, right? It is a key set of technologies that will help us shape the world of tomorrow. And if we don't do this the right way, then we don't get the world we want to live in. We don't get the planet we want to live on in the shape we want to have it in, right? And so we should take this seriously. It is a lot of money that goes into this, a lot of investment. And if we sit and do too little or nothing, then others will go and make it for us, right? And I think it's always better to live in a future that we design ourselves in one than in one that others make for us. In this sense, thank you all for being here today, and I hope I will see you all again on a different occasion. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.